Hi, Susan le Jeune, British High Commissioner to Canada here, and I'm delighted to welcome to this series of podcasts Seth Klein, all-round brilliant man and activist, who we're going to talk today about the challenges facing us all in terms of climate change. And we're doing this in the context of the UK's hosting of the Climate Ambition Summit on the 12th of December. Seth, thank you so much for sparing the time to talk to me today. It's really wonderful to have you.
Nice to be with you.
So we're going to talk about to lots of people in the course of these interviews, but I wanted to hear about your perspective on the main challenges facing us in the year leading up to the COP26 conference.
Well, it's right there in the title. I think it's just about ambition and ramping up ambition. Paris was 2015. In 2018, we got the IPCC special report telling us that we needed to at least have our GHG emissions by 2030 and then get to zero mid-century. So now we have to align. We have to align the former with the latter. And we've got a long way to go with that. As everybody knows, the commitments that were tabled in Paris, Paris was important, and it set that goal of holding temperature rise to 1.5 degrees. But everyone's tabled plans get us to double that, which is horrific. And also, as was widely recognized at the time, there's no real enforcement mechanisms the way we've come to understand, say, if it was a trade agreement, where there would be consequences for breaking the rules. And so we need that. And the other area, of course, the big omission in the whole UN framework is that it never mentions the words fossil fuels, oil, gas, or coal. And that's the result of years of successful lobbying by that industry. So we either need to fix that within that framework, or I'm one of the people, I'm involved in this initiative for a new fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. The idea is that it would be a complementary treaty that would tackle the production or supply side.
Fantastic, thank you. And I think you're absolutely right. What we've done so far has been okay, but we now have a genuinely burning platform, and we don't have any more time. This is it. If we don't do it now, then the damage will be irreparable. And I know that in your recently published book, which is called, I'm going to look to make sure I get the title right, Mobilising Canada for the Climate Emergency. You talk about, there it is, fantastic.
A good war, mobilizing Canada for the climate emergency.
So you talk about the need to adopt the same sort of mindset that we had in wartime to this because of the scale of the danger and the threat facing us. Could you just go into a little more detail about what you mean by that?
Yes. So my whole book is structured around lessons from the Second World War. The last time we faced an existential threat and had to mobilize across society. I should say that when I first started out on the path of writing this book, it wasn't going to be structured that way. I set out to write a book about what do we do about this harrowing gap between what the science says we have to do and what our politics seems prepared to entertain. And I also started from another opening premise, which is, here we're talking in Canada. If you look at Canada's greenhouse gas emissions going back the last 20 years, what you see is a flat line. That is the best you can say about it. The emissions are no longer rising, but neither are they falling. In fact, notably, the UK has done substantially better than Canada has over that 20-year period. But we're not bending the curve, as we've come to understand in COVID times. We've only flatlined. And so what we've been doing isn't working. And I had always planned to have a chapter on lessons from the Second World War because I'd long been intrigued by World War II as this reminder of how quickly we are capable of retooling the economy. But the more I delved into that research, the more I started to see more and more parallels. And not just on the economic front. How was public opinion marshaled then? How did we retool the economy? How did we pay for it? How did we navigate Confederation? What was the relationship to inequality? What did we do for returning soldiers as a model for just transition for fossil fuel workers today? And so the more I dug into it, the more I became inspired, actually, by this realization that we've done this before, and ultimately decided to structure the entire book around lessons from the Second World War.
Do you think, leading on from that, that the coronavirus pandemic has some of the same elements in the way that we have been forced to act very quickly and together, and put aside political differences and all the rest of it? Do you think that actually helps us with climate change?
It's a mixed bag. So, very awkward timing, of course. I wrote my whole book before the pandemic. I had actually shipped it off for final copy edit 3 days before the pandemic. And it certainly messed with the plans a little bit because, as you say, the whole premise of the book was that we needed to excavate this historic reminder of how quickly we're capable of pivoting. And now here we all are, living through and experiencing that in real time. And that's both helpful and a challenge. Momentum was really building a year ago on the climate file. We had this incredible youth-led day of mobilization a little over a year ago, 1 million Canadians on the street. That is, to my knowledge, the largest single day of political mobilization in Canadian history. We saw incredible solidarity actions in support of the Wet'suwet'en land defenders. So things were moving. And the pandemic, of course, has pushed everything off the front burner, everything else. And that makes it hard. But you were alluding to this in your question. I also think it sets us up well for what we now need to do in the face of the climate emergency. Social solidarity is at a generational high. Our appreciation of the role of government and the importance of public services is at an all-time high. Cooperation across Confederation is actually at a new high. Our respect for scientists has been greatly restored. And so that's all good. And, I also think the economy has been massively whacked, of course, by the pandemic. And so there's lots of agreement that we need a state-led investment path out of this. And the real debate becomes, well, what form will that take? Will it be support for the old, or will it catapult us into the new? And that's the challenge before us now.
Yeah, and I think one of the other things that's in your book is the fact that crises, as well as bringing communities together, societies together, can also exacerbate inequality.
Yes.
And you point to that as one of the things that we don't talk about quite as much as we should in terms of climate change. And I think it's also without a doubt, one of the biggest challenges of COVID, because we have seen that it impacts disproportionately on certain parts of society. So what do you think are the things that need to be taken into account as we address this to ensure that those inequalities don't get worse?
Mm-hmm. So I spent a fair bit of time on this in the book. There are lots of climate policy purists that you can talk to out there who will say, don't link the climate stuff we have to do to inequality and social justice. This is really complicated enough, don't weigh it down with these other considerations. And I respectfully disagree with them because, first of all, these issues are linked. The richer you are, the higher your emissions. The poorer you are individually or as a community or as a country, the more vulnerable you are to the impacts of climate change. But the main reason as well that I'm arguing that we need to link these things from a mobilization point of view is because that's how you win. I actually, because I'm talking to you, I will mention that one of the inspiring resources I stumbled across when I was writing the book was this lovely short little book that Keynes had written to the Chancellor of the Exchequer in the opening months of the war about how to pay for the war. And what's so interesting about it is that he's actually saying, in addition to coming up with all these innovative ways to pay for the war, he's saying this is the moment that we have to tackle inequality. Because when you're asking people to mobilize across society and undertake something at the grand level that we now need to do today, that's how you get everyone on the bus. That's where social solidarity comes from.
And it's absolutely true that in those immediate post-war years, the decades that came immediately afterwards, social mobility and people rising up, increasing their levels of education, all those things improved, I mean, incredibly in the UK. It is the biggest change, I think, the biggest social changes that we ever had happened in those post-war years.
There are these fascinating parallels in both the UK and Canadian experiences here. For both of our countries, if you look at the period just before World War II, that's when income inequality is at its height. The share of income going to the top 1%. In Canada, maxes out in 1938. UK as well, right around that time. But as you say, the war itself jolted this incredible redistribution for the next 3 decades. In the UK, of course, no sooner had the war been won than Churchill gets replaced by the most activist Labour government in your history. In Canada, our first major social programs come in during the war. Unemployment insurance, 1940, the family allowance in 1944, the Marsh Commission, and Marsh had studied with Beveridge at the London School of Economics. He writes the Marsh Report, which is really the architecture for the whole post-war welfare state in Canada, is written during the war and is offered up to Canadians as this pledge that the society that they will come back to will look different. That's when you start to see the enlistment numbers go up. Yeah. That's when we secure social solidarity. That's when it really became a national mobilization project.
So, and that's what we need now, in your view. We need something similar translated to the climate, to addressing the climate challenge. So, what are the elements that you would just say you're in control. You've got a blank sheet of paper. So you're the Labour Prime Minister after the war in the UK. So that's you. What are you going to do? What would you do?
Well, I mean, let's talk about the present. So in the wake of my book coming out, I'm frequently asked, well, how do you know when a government is actually in emergency mode? And so for me, I've got these 4 markers out of that. Number 1, you spend what it takes to win. Number 2, you create new economic institutions to get the job done. In Canada, C.D. Howe, who oversaw this extraordinary wartime production in Canada, who was no lefty, by the way, created 28 crown corporations during the war in order to expedite that military production. So you create new economic institutions to get the job done. Number 3, you move from voluntary to mandatory measures as required. So much of why all we've managed to do in Canada is flatline our emissions is because if you look at all of the federal and provincial actions to date, almost all of them are voluntary. We incentivize change, we encourage change, we give rebates, we send price signals. That's not what you do in an emergency. In an emergency, you say, this is what you got to do by this date. And the 4th marker is that you tell the truth. You speak about the urgency of the crisis at hand. And when you think about the leaders we most remember from the Second World War, most notably the UK's leader at that time, is that they struck this remarkable balance between being forthright about the crisis and yet still communicating hope.
Yeah.
Our leaders today are not being forthright about what we have to do. And so if you look at those 4 markers, spend what it takes, create new economic institutions, shift to mandatory, and tell the truth. With respect to COVID, I feel like our leadership actually hits all those markers.
Yeah.
We can quibble over the specifics, but they hit them all. And with respect to the climate emergency, they hit none of them. So that's got to change.
So that's got to change. And they can. We've seen that they can do it. You're absolutely right.
And I think
we've also seen, I think, that when people know why they need to do something, they are willing to accept legislation, not just suggestion, direction and instruction.
But the leadership
when they know
matters.
why they're doing it.
Yes, but the leadership matters in that moment.
Yeah.
And there too, if you had said to Canadians in 1938, does Mackenzie King and this gang and in his cabinet, do they have it in them to shift in this way? I think most Canadians would have said no, and they would have been wrong. And if you had said to me 10 months ago, does the group of people in finance at the Bank of Canada have it in them to audaciously create these new programs like the CERB? And I would have cynically said no too. I don't think there was anyone who's home, and I would have been wrong. sometimes you got to change the leadership, and that's what happened in the UK in 1939.
Yeah.
So maybe they have it in them and maybe they don't. You never know.
Yeah. So one of the challenges, I think, for any government organizing a conference like the one that we're heading towards in Glasgow, is that it can become quite formal, with prepared speeches, with the same old voices being heard. And as we saw from the Greta Thunberg-led movement, some of the most powerful voices in the climate argument are not the people you would expect to be dominating this. You know, everybody wants their bit of the action, but the people who are actually listened to are have been people like her. So how can we ensure that that is part of the conversation as we approach the conference?
From young people specifically.
Yeah, well, yeah, the young people specifically, but anybody who's not a representative of, you know, the established order, if you like.
Well, you're quite right that the most memorable moments, I think, from 30 years of these UN meetings have come from youth, and young women. They've all been young women, and often young women of color. I'm no expert in international treaties, so I don't know how to bring that about other than to make the space for it. But one way or another, internationally, nationally, locally, we have to do everything we can for those youth voices to exercise their political muscle. They're already doing it, of course. That's why we were all out on the street a year ago. But I see examples. I mean, Greta's leadership has been so pivotal to that. There are things we can do to enhance it, of course, like lower the voting age. I'm a big proponent of lowering the voting age to 16, because that would make politicians have to listen to more of them. But even without that, they're having a huge impact. You know, my wife's a city councillor here in Vancouver, who moved the climate emergency motion in Vancouver a year and a half ago, which was the first in English Canada. And I would say out of that, Vancouver has, I think, the most ambitious municipal climate emergency plan in North America. So she's led a lot of that. I'm very proud of her. And her climate motions have been passed mostly unanimously across the political divide. I mean, the Vancouver City Council, for those who don't know, and why would you, is very politically divided, and no one has a majority. And yet there's been near unanimous support. Christine, my wife, would say that the reason that happened is because dozens of young people skipped school, they rallied outside, they spoke before council. It did not matter that they could not vote yet. They filled the galleries, they've watched, and they've made it politically impossible for the electeds to vote against these things.
I think it's really important. And I think, you know, because they've achieved that, those young people will be motivated to go on and do more. And I think the worst possible outcome would be for all this huge groundswell of opinion and feeling not to lead to anything, because then you end up with a whole lot of dissatisfied young people, and people who are disillusioned with the political process, and that is the worst possible position to be in. You do not want to turn young people off when they are motivated. I think one of the other things that's really important about and interesting about the way the climate debate is developing is that you have governments which are trying to legislate or encourage, as you say, in the case of the Canadian government. But you've also got a huge groundswell of opinion from consumers and investors. And so I think when you look at some of the major institutional investors, big companies like BlackRock, who've taken quite progressive decisions recently about how they invest, the pressure for that has come from the people who are putting their money in those companies, and the same with people who are shareholders of some of the big companies, or people who just, as a consumer like you and me, our voices make a difference, because if we don't want to buy their stuff, they're not going to make any money. So I think that you have those two levels of pressure on governments, and I think it's really important that they're both listened to.
I mean, that consumer pressure and investor pressure is certainly important. And there have indeed been some promising developments of late. And the divestment movement, I would add to that, has been part of that, and an important way in which people have been able to give expression to the climate emergency. My caution, of course, in all of that, and this is one of those key lessons I'm trying to pull out of the Second World War experience, is that if we hope that to achieve what we now need to achieve at the speed and scale required over the next 10 years, to achieve that through the voluntary measures of investors or companies, or that the price signals of the market will get us there in time, I fear
it's not
we're
enough.
fried. We're fried. Yeah. And so it's got to be mandated.
Yeah. And, you know, for example, cars, petrol cars, we've just brought forward the date at which there will be no more petrol cars sold in the UK, because, you know, consumers will have no choice. If you want a new car, it's going to have to be an electric car, not even a hybrid. It's got to be a fully electric car.
Yes.
And that's the government, I mean, working with the industry, because I think, you know, that's an important part. You can't just ignore the concerns of your industry and your manufacturers. But that's a bold step forward. And I think, you know, these sorts of things are really important in showing other developed economies that it is possible, and we can do it.
I did, yes, and I saw that UK move. I tweeted that, and it's helpful because it's an example of what I'm getting at. If it's serious, if it's an emergency, you mandate the banning of certain things by certain dates. I still think the date's too far out, and so the pressure has to keep building. We need a kind of competitive, we need a new arms race where people are beating each other by 5-year increments in order to get them at time. And then I would also add to that, because we're talking about petrol cars, you know, why do our governments continue to allow those cars to advertise? Or if they do, at least put a warning label on.
Like we do with cigarettes.
Like
we did with cigarettes.
So cigarettes, we ban their television advertising. Their print advertising has a label, right? So we need a label that says, beware, you're going to have a really hard time finding a gas station in 5 years. So at least we can't tell people who insist on buying these things that they weren't warned.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, and I think also, you know, it'll be like smoking eventually. You'll be a social pariah if you have. I mean, at the moment in the UK, I mean, nobody really drives diesel cars anymore. And I really noticed it when I lived on the continent, how different the air felt when people were still driving diesel cars. So yeah, I think, and it's that sort of societal disapproval that also will make a difference, I think, to people's behavior, you know, when it's no longer socially acceptable to do it.
And those societal shifts happen dramatically quickly sometimes.
Yeah.
Like I remember when we banned smoking from bars and restaurants, and the industry said it was going to be the end of them. I remember when seatbelts were made mandatory, and this was some terrible infringement on our civil liberties. And then the change is made, and then they just become the new normal with remarkable speed.
And you can't believe it was ever any other way. Right. And it happens remarkably quickly. You know, and things like you know, when I was a child, there were no child seats either in cars, and no seat belts either. So you just sat there in the back of the car as a kid. So obviously, if there's a crash, you went straight through the front window. I mean, you know, it's and that's. I mean, I'm old, but I'm not that old. So it's.
I remember these changes, and my grandkids, when I have them, aren't going to know what a gas station is, except what they see in old movies.
Yeah, and I think that you know the way in which you know, things like food waste. My kids don't throw out food. When I look at the way, and my parents didn't throw out food either. Because of the war, they lived through the war. But there's a generation in between, which is mine. Many people who did, because it was a way of showing, you know, comfort, and having a full fridge was almost a social statement. But I think we've now got back to where my parents were. So it's really interesting, and I think your war analogy applies very, very well to that sort of stuff too. And also, you know, not having a house overheated and all that stuff that my parents' generation just did. And we're coming back to that now. You know.
There's an irony that many of the things that people were told to do and that were rationed in the war while not done for climate reasons,
Yeah.
whether it's home heating, as you say, whether it's recycling all manner of stuff, the rationing of tires and fuel,
Yeah.
you know, they all encouraging people to not drive alone,
Yeah.
but to carpool or take
Yes.
transit, you know,
Yeah.
all of those things.
Yeah,
Compounding.
and eating far less meat, if any meat at all, growing your own vegetables, you know, it's extraordinary. It's extraordinary. I think you've really hit on something very pertinent. So I think we're running out of time, unfortunately, because I could spend all afternoon talking to you. If you could, so one hope for what we could achieve at the next COP26 in Glasgow next November. One thing you could encourage us as the UK to deliver.
It's hard to just say one. I mean, obviously those country targets need to add up to 1.5 degrees as per the IPCC. And this time we need enforcement mechanisms. There has to be a consequence. We need a regime that both supports the countries that need help through the transition. So that means increasing financial transfers to those countries that need the help, and punishes those who don't. Otherwise, it's just aspirational and we've run out the clock.
Yeah, and carrots. So carrots and sticks. And I think you're right. And I think the need to make sure that we bring the developing world along with us and don't just tell them what to do, but give them the tools and the money in particular to do it. Absolutely crucial to achieving this. So fantastic. Thank you so much. It's been a really wonderful conversation. Really nice to meet you too. I hope to meet you in person. Before I leave this country next summer, I am planning certainly to come back to Vancouver at least once, if not more than once. So when we can travel again, I look forward to doing this in person. That would be fantastic.
Very nice.
Thank you so much for your time.
Bye.